say natural selection causes evolution. The fruit fly is often brought up as an example. They nuke these flies and microwave them and x-ray them and get them to have all sorts of mutated babies. They get flies with curled wings. They can't, fly around. Flies with no wings at all. What do you call that? A crawl? He can't fly. But you get all these mutated flies, and every fly they get's worse off than the original fly. And that's proof of how we get ahead. Folks, that's not evolution. It's still a fly. And it's a worse off fly. This one about the peppered moth was proven wrong several years ago. The guy had to glue dead moths to the trees in order to take the picture for your textbook, kids. The peppered moth experiment is baloney. It didn't happen. It didn't work. But it's still in the textbooks. Then evidence from structure called the homology argument. He mentioned this as one of his evidences for evolution, his lines of reasoning. Similar four-limb structures in the human, the cat, the whale, the horse, etc. It's true. There's a similar design in the forelimb. I don't argue with that. I agree. I taught biology for years. But similar structure proves a common designer. Doesn't prove a common ancestor. And if you were in a court of law and you brought this up as evidence for evolution, I'm telling you, a freshman law student would poke the holes in this one. Say, excuse me, Your Honor, this doesn't prove we had a common ancestor. Couldn't it prove the same guy designed everything? I could point out that the lug nuts on a Chevy will screw onto a Pontiac. It doesn't prove they both evolved from a Honda 21 million years ago. The same guys are designing them, folks. And I could probably point out that if you looked at the code of Microsoft Windows as opposed to Microsoft PowerPoint, you'd find billions of similarities. Probably spell check is exactly the same in both programs. Because they're coming from the same designers, that's why.
It's time.
I got more.
Thank you. Please, Dr. Paulson can begin.
So I have 10 minutes. Okay. Well, you can probably tell that Dr. Hovind has given his presentation hundreds of times, thousands of times. Is this still on? And this is the first time I've spoken publicly about evolution. But, so he's got some good jokes. But unfortunately in science, truth is not determined by who can tell the best jokes. So we have to look at evidence. Dr. Hovind has, to be quite frank, he's made a lot of false and misleading statements. And I would like to be able to rebut them all, but I don't think I can do it in 10 minutes. I couldn't even write them down as fast as he was saying them. I told you at the beginning that my goal for tonight was to teach you something about science. And I think I can claim to have some experience to do this because I've been doing research for 28 years almost. And probably the most important lesson, which I hope I've impressed upon you, is that science is not just a body of knowledge, it's a method. It's a process, the scientific method. And I told you about forming hypotheses, testing them, and so forth. What I told you on the slides was obviously just an outline of all the deductions and predictions and evidence that has been put forward. Dr. Hovind will cite one small piece of evidence and say, this is all they got. But that one small piece of evidence is just an example. There are libraries full of reports, research reports, that back up all these things. As I showed you, there were some tough tests that evolution has been put to. We can't show that a dinosaur turned into a bird because it took millions of years and we can't wind the clock back. Maybe Dr. Hovind seems to expect that we ought to be able to do that. Nobody says, evolution doesn't say that you can see a dinosaur turn into a bird or a lizard turn into a mammal before your very eyes. It takes a long time and people went around them. So it has to be inferred from other kinds of evidence. And that's why we do this scientific approach. That's the way to learn about things that you can't observe directly. He might just as well question what we know about the stars, about the sun. Nobody's ever been to the sun. How do they know there's helium there? But there are ways to test these things indirectly. You don't have to go to the sun to find out its composition. You can use the methods of physics and chemistry and analyze the light and the other radiation from the sun. Dr. Hovind has ignored or belittled most of the points that I made, but I can assure you that none of his arguments would stand up to scrutiny if we had time to scrutinize them. Let me come back to his arguments a little later, but first, let's look at his hypothesis. Did he make one example of a prediction made by the hypothesis of creationism? Even one prediction that would distinguish it from evolution. He predicted that there would be fossils. So what? Evolution predicts that too. Did he show one way that it could conceivably be disproved? Well, maybe I missed it, but I don't think it was there. So he hasn't put his hypothesis to the test. Evolution has been put to the test many times for the last 150 years. And despite what he says, it hasn't been disproved. Creationists could put their theory to the test. I can suggest some experiments he could do. Dr. Hovind has this fairy tale about how the fossils were all laid down in the Great Flood. Of course, he never comes up with any explanation of where all the water came from, where it went, where all the mud came from, how it turned into rock instantaneously, how the intrusions of granite into the sedimentary rocks formed instantaneously. There's so much granite around the world. We know that granite forms at 1,000 degrees Celsius. That's when it solidifies. The granite that's in the earth today, intruded into sedimentary rocks, presumably must have formed after the flood, after the rocks were laid down. You can calculate that all the heat in those granite rocks would have been so much, all the heat released by cooling those rocks would have been so much that the oceans would have been boiling. At least it solves the problem of how Noah fed those 20,000 species of terrestrial animals and reptiles, birds, and animals. He fed them boiled fish. So, he could test his hypothesis, for example, by looking at coprolites or by looking at tree pollen. His hypothesis predicts that dinosaurs and modern plants were on the earth at the same time, and so in the coprolites, which are fossilized dinosaur dung, you should predict, his theory would predict, that the pollen of modern plants should be in there. But it never is. Of course, the creationists know that their predictions won't be confirmed if they're too tough, so they don't do any experiments. Aside the fact that Dr. Hovind's trying to avoid having his hypothesis tested is that he goes through some amazing mental contortions to explain away the data that's staring him right in the face. And all these, it's kind of hard to even begin to list them all. So many of these things that he comes up with. All the fossils being laid down in the flood. There are so many fossils in the rocks of the world. The sedimentary layers are, on average, miles thick. And the number of fossils is so great that if they were all alive at the same time, well, there wouldn't have been any standing room for Noah to build his ark. In fact, the animals would have been piled on top of each other. So those kinds of things just doesn't make sense. He comes up with a good answer to every little thing, but altogether they don't add up to anything. Sorry.
Say natural selection causes evolution. The fruit fly is often brought up as an example. They nuke these flies and microwave them and x-ray them and get them to have all sorts of mutated babies. They get flies with curled wings. They can't, fly around his lines of reasoning. Similar four-limb structures in the human, the cat, the whale, the horse, etc. It's true. There's a similar design in the forelimb. I don't argue with that. I agree. I taught biology for years. But similar structure, that's proof of how we get ahead. Folks, that's not evolution. It's still a fly. And it's a worse-off fly. This one about the peppered moth was proven wrong several years ago. The guy had to glue dead moths to the trees in order to take the picture for your textbook. Flies with no wings at all. What do you call that? A crawl? He can't fly. But you get all these mutated flies, and every fly they get's worse off than the original fly. And kids, the peppered moth experiment is baloney. It didn't happen. It didn't work. But it's still in the textbooks. Then evidence from structure called the homology argument. He mentioned this as one of his evidences for evolution.